Guess what? Because I pay you salary. Okay, what happened to you? Okay, why are you so worthless? Do you feel proud that you are this worthless lady? Do you feel this proud that you are this worthless? Shut the fuck up because I pay your salary, you dumb bitch. Okay? That's what happened. Look, what is gonna happen? What is gonna happen?
You need to leave.
You are a worthless piece of shit. Yeah, call back up. No wonder no wonder you fucking died.
You need to leave.
There's nothing that we can do, okay? But don't worry, we're gonna keep this high.
You need to leave.
You are.
You put your hand in my face one more time. I have a fucking issue. Don't do that.
The morning of April 10th, 2025, started like every other morning at Deltona Middle School. Kids walking through metal detectors, backpacks tossed over shoulders, the smell of cafeteria food drifting down fluorescent-lit hallways, teachers scanning lanyards, the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of a Florida school day. Nobody walked in thinking it would end with two adults in handcuffs. Nobody thought that by the time that same bell rang again, a law enforcement officer would be fighting inside the walls of a middle school, not against a student, not against a stranger who wandered in off the street, but against a mother and a father who had come there presumably for their child. This is the story of what happened when a routine school matter turned into something the cameras could not look away from. And when you see what the deputy's footage captured, you're going to have questions. Real ones. Inside a middle school, this should never have happened. Stay with me. Deltona, Florida. Volusia County. Population just under 100,000. It's one of those sprawling Central Florida towns that grew fast in the 1990s subdivisions and strip malls pressed up against wetlands, families settling in from Puerto Rico, New York, the Dominican Republic, building something new in the humid Florida heat. It is in every real sense a working-class community, people who get up early, people who work hard, people who care about their kids. Deltona Middle School sits in the heart of that community. Roughly 1,000 students pass through those doors every week. Teachers who know these kids' names. Counselors who've seen them grow. A staff that by most accounts is doing the difficult, underfunded, unglamorous work of educating young people in 2025, which is to say, one of the hardest jobs in America. And stationed inside that school, like most public schools in Volusia County, is a school resource deputy, an SRD. Law enforcement embedded inside the building, not as an intimidation tactic, not as a prison warden, but as a first line of safety, a presence, someone trained to de-escalate, to protect, to respond when things go sideways, because sometimes they do. On this particular morning, the deputy was doing what school resource deputies do most of the time, existing in the background, a reassuring uniform in a hallway, a familiar face to students who passed by. Nothing about the early hours suggested this would be anything other than a Tuesday, but this wasn't the first sign something was wrong. There were signals, friction points that existed before this morning ever began. The kind of slow-building pressure that institutions often miss or choose not to address until it is standing in their hallway, loud and unmistakable. The full picture of what led Jorge Rivera and Dagmarie Aponte Iturrino to that school on that morning has not been made entirely public. But the fact that it escalated the way it did suggests this was not a situation that materialized out of nowhere. It rarely is. But somewhere off campus, two people were already in motion. Jorge Rivera and Dagmarie Aponte Iturrino. A couple. Parents. And on this morning they had a reason to be at Deltona Middle School. The exact nature of that reason, what specifically brought them there, what grievance or concern or communication had prompted them to show up, that piece of the story has not been fully laid out in public records. What we do know is that they came, that they entered the building, that there was at some point a conversation or an attempt at one with school staff or administration, and that something in that conversation, some word, some decision, some perceived slight or unresolved tension, lit a fuse that was apparently already burning. This is where you need to pay attention, because what happens next happens fast. It is almost never one single thing that causes a situation like this to explode. In nearly every case of a confrontation like this, parents versus school officials, civilians versus law enforcement in an institutional setting, there's a layered history underneath it. There's frustration that predates the day. There's a feeling, real or imagined, of not being heard, of a system that feels designed to dismiss you, of rules that don't bend even when you're convinced they should. None of that justifies what came next, but understanding it is the only way to make sense of how two parents in a school, surrounded by children, in front of cameras they had to know were rolling, ended up where they ended up. At some point during the encounter, the school resource deputy became involved. Whether they were called in, stepped in on their own, or were already part of the conversation, the deputy was now the person standing between whatever this situation had become and wherever it was heading. Witnesses would later describe the energy in that hallway as charged, voices elevated, body language tight, the kind of atmosphere that makes nearby adults instinctively pull children in a different direction. The deputy attempted to manage the situation. That's the job. That's the training. Talk it down, create distance, establish calm. At this point, the situation could still have been contained, but it wasn't. And this is the moment that separates what could have been a tense but forgettable Tuesday from a felony arrest record, a news cycle, and a school full of children who witnessed something they should never have had to see. The deputy's attempts to de-escalate were not received. The window, and there is almost always a window, however narrow, closed. It didn't work. And this is where things take a turn no one expected. The confrontation crossed a line, a physical line. Jorge Rivera and Dagmarie Aponte Iturrino together, in what authorities would later describe as a coordinated or simultaneous act, attacked the school resource deputy. Not a shove, not a push in the heat of a moment. An attack, inside a middle school, in a hallway where children go to class. The deputy, one person outnumbered, had to contend with two adults, who at this point were not interested in de-escalation. The sounds of the struggle, according to those familiar with situations like this, are jarring in a way that is difficult to describe if you haven't heard it. The impact of bodies, urgent voices, the scrape of shoes on tile, the unmistakable chaos of a fight in a place that is supposed to be safe. And what the footage shows next raises serious questions. Because when you watch a bodycam recording from inside a school, when the frame shakes, when voices spike, when the institutional calm of a Tuesday morning collapses into something urgent and physical, it forces a question that the arrest report alone doesn't answer. How did we get here? Not just these two people, not just this school. How did we as a society arrive at a place where this footage exists at all, where a camera mounted on a deputy's chest inside a middle school captures a moment like this, and it isn't shocking anymore? It's a news story. It's content. It's Tuesday. That should disturb you. Backup was called. That call went out fast. Additional deputies responded to Deltona Middle School. When law enforcement arrived in force, the situation was brought under control. Both adults were taken into custody at the scene. Jorge Rivera and Dagmarie Aponte Iturrino were placed under arrest. The charges: battery on a law enforcement officer. That is not a misdemeanor in the state of Florida. That is a felony. A charge that carries real consequences. Prison time. A permanent record. The kind of mark that follows a person into every job application, every background check, every custody hearing, for the rest of their lives. Both adults were transported to the Volusia County Branch Jail, booked, processed, their mugshots taken under the same flat institutional light that photographs thousands of people every year who made a decision they cannot take back. The deputy was evaluated. In situations like this, even when visible injuries are minimal, protocol requires medical assessment. The psychological toll of being physically attacked, of having to defend yourself in your own workplace, in a school, against people who are supposed to be part of the community you serve, that is not a small thing. That does not clock out at the end of a shift. Here is the part of the story that doesn't make the headline, but maybe should. And there's one detail most people are missing. Somewhere in that building, while all of this was unfolding, while the hallway became a crime scene, and deputies flooded in, and two adults were placed in handcuffs, there was a child, their child, a student at Deltona Middle School, who came to school that morning, not knowing that by the time the day was over, both of their parents would be in the back of a patrol car. That detail rarely surfaces in coverage like this. The arrest, the charges, the body cam, those get the attention. But the kid becomes a footnote. And I would argue that child is the entire story. Because whatever built up to this moment, whatever frustration, or grievance or failure of communication, drove two parents to make the choices they made, that child is the one who will carry it longest. That is worth sitting with. We are living through a period of extreme tension between parents and institutions, between families and schools, between civilians and law enforcement. That tension is not imaginary. It is documented, measurable, real. In the years since 2020, incidents of parents confronting school officials have increased dramatically across the country. School board meetings that once drew a dozen people now fill auditoriums. Administrators have resigned en masse. Teachers have quit at historic rates. And law enforcement officers stationed inside schools, people who signed up to protect children, have found themselves increasingly caught in the crossfire of adult grievances that have nothing to do with the kids. There is something happening in this country at the intersection of fear and frustration. Parents who feel like the system is failing their children. Communities that feel unheard. Institutions that feel overwhelmed and underfunded. And in that pressure cooker, boundaries that used to be unthinkable start to dissolve. A parent attacking a deputy inside a school 10 years ago, that would have been so rare as to be almost unbelievable. Today it is a news cycle, a social media post, a moment in a longer, darker pattern. The children at Deltona Middle School went home that afternoon. Most of them probably knew something had happened. Word travels fast in a school. Kids see more than adults give them credit for. Some of them may have heard the confrontation. Some of them may have seen the aftermath, the extra deputies, the yellow tape of adult decisions stretched across their ordinary Tuesday. And what do you suppose they took from that? What does a 12-year-old think when the adults in their world, the ones who are supposed to model what it looks like to handle conflict, to advocate without violence, to respect authority, even when you disagree with it, what does that child think when those adults are led out in handcuffs? That question does not have an easy answer. And the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, to their credit, is not pretending it does. What they have said, clearly and publicly, is this: the deputy did their job. The deputy tried to manage a volatile situation, and when that situation turned physical, the deputy was not at fault. The law is unambiguous. You do not get to put your hands on a law enforcement officer because you are angry. You do not get to assault someone who is wearing a badge in a school because the conversation did not go the way you wanted. That line exists for a reason, and it cannot be blurred. But here is what I keep coming back to. Here is the loop I cannot close. We don't know exactly what happened in those minutes before the confrontation turned physical. We don't know what was said to the couple, by the couple. We don't know if there was a moment where things could have gone differently. A word chosen differently. A door opened rather than closed. A conversation that someone, somewhere, chose not to have earlier, that could have made this morning unnecessary. We don't know. And that uncertainty, that gap between the headline and the full human story, is exactly why situations like this will keep happening until we decide to look at the whole picture. Not just the arrest, not just the charges, but the days and weeks and months of pressure and miscommunication and systemic failure that preceded a moment where two parents decided that violence was the answer to whatever question they were asking. Jorge Rivera and Dagmarie Aponte Iturrino are now facing felony charges. Their futures and the future of their child, who was somewhere in that school when all of this unfolded, will be shaped by what a judge and jury decide, by attorneys and evidence and the cold precision of the legal system doing its work. The deputy went home that night. The students went home that night. The school will open its doors again tomorrow. But here is the question I want you to sit with. The one that I think matters more than the charges or the mugshots or the bodycam footage. What does it say about a moment in time, about where we are, as a society, as communities, as people trying to raise children, and keep schools safe, and enforce laws, and somehow do all of it with grace? What does it say that this is happening in middle schools? Not in dark alleys, not in disputed territories, in middle schools. The bell rang at Deltona Middle School on the morning of April 10th, 2025, and for a few minutes everything was normal. Then it wasn't. And somewhere in that space between the ordinary and the unthinkable, there is a conversation this country desperately needs to have, before the next bell rings, before the next hallway becomes a crime scene, before the next set of children watches the adults in their world fail them in the most visible way possible. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This is the kind of story that is easy to scroll past and hard to actually think about. If it made you think, drop a comment below. Tell me what you believe is driving moments like this, and what, if anything, you think can stop them. Subscribe if you haven't. There is more coming.